The stagecoach groaned like a dying animal. Every lurch and shudder of its iron-bound wheels sent a jolt through Clara Holt's bones, a constant, jarring reminder that she was a world away from everything she had ever known. Outside, the green fields of Missouri had long ago given way to the vast, empty plains, and now the plains themselves were surrendering to the jagged teeth of the Montana mountains. The air had grown thin and cold, smelling of pine and damp earth. Clara clutched the handle of the small trunk on the seat beside her. It was not much, but it was everything. Inside lay 2 simple calico dresses, a worn family Bible with her mother's name pressed in gold on the cover, and a small, tin-framed photograph of parents she could barely remember. More important than any of it was the letter tucked inside her bodice, its paper softened and creased from 100 readings. It was a letter of promise, signed by a man named Amos Creed, a man who had seen her photograph and agreed to pay her passage west in exchange for her hand in marriage. Hope was a fragile, fluttering thing, like a bird held in cupped hands. For 2 years, since her father's passing, she had been little more than a servant in her own home, subject to the whims of a stepmother who saw her only as a burden. Mr. Creed's letters, though sparse and practical, had offered an escape. He wrote of his homestead, of the wide sky and the chance to build a life. To Clara, who had only ever known the cramped and coal-dusted streets of St. Louis, it sounded like a kingdom. She was not a romantic girl, not anymore. She simply wanted a place to belong, a life that was her own. The other passengers were a study in weariness. A farmer named Elias, his wife, and their 2 pale children huddled together, their faces grim. A portly salesman with a waxed mustache, who had been full of grand stories back in Omaha, had fallen silent as the mountains closed in around them. The driver and the shotgun guard were tense, their eyes constantly scanning the dense timber that crowded the muddy track they called a road. Rain began to fall. Not a gentle spring shower, but a cold, persistent drizzle that blurred the world outside the window into a smear of gray and green. The horses strained, their hooves sucking at the thick mud. The stagecoach slowed to a crawl, its wheels sinking deeper with every turn. "Cursed mud," the driver's voice rumbled from outside. "Going to be the death of us." His words were more prophetic than he knew. It happened, without warning. A crack of rifle fire split the air, sharp and deafening. Wood splintered from the coach's frame. The horses screamed, rearing in their harnesses. Another shot followed, and the salesman yelped, clutching his arm where a spray of dark red blossomed on his sleeve. "Bandits!" the guard bellowed, his own shotgun roaring in response. "Out! Everybody out and run for the trees!" Chaos erupted. The farmer shoved the door open, pulling his wife and children out into the mud. Clara scrambled after them, her heart hammering against her ribs. Rough hands grabbed at her, not to help, but to hinder. A man with a dirty kerchief covering his face loomed over her, his eyes cold and hard. He ripped the small trunk from her grasp, its handle tearing free with a sound of splitting wood. He shoved her, hard, and she fell sideways into the mire. Panic was a blinding force. She pushed herself up, the cold, thick mud clinging to her dress, her hair, her skin. She saw the farmer's family disappearing into the dark wall of pines. She saw the driver lying still on the ground. She had to run. She scrambled forward, her feet sinking deep. As she pulled her right foot free, the mud held fast to her shoe, sucking it from her foot with a thick, final gulp. There was no time to retrieve it. Another gunshot cracked nearby, and she ran on, half-shod, terror lending her a strength she did not know she possessed. She did not look back. She plunged into the forest, the low-hanging branches of the pines scratching at her face and tearing at the fabric of her dress. The sounds of the ambush faded behind her, replaced by the pounding of her own blood in her ears and the desperate, ragged sound of her breathing. She ran until her lungs burned and her legs refused to carry her another step. Then she walked, The rain fell harder now, plastering her thin dress to her body, chilling her to the bone. The single shoe on her left foot was a mockery, filling with mud and water, while her right foot, clad only in a stocking, was a map of pain. Every stone, every twig, every sharp edge of the forest floor was an agony. She stumbled and fell, catching herself with her hands, scraping the skin from her palms. She rose and pressed on, driven by a primal instinct that had replaced all thought. The forest was a living, breathing thing, and it was utterly indifferent to her suffering. The wind howled through the high branches of the pines, a low, mournful sound that seemed to seep into her soul. The world was 1,000 shades of green and gray, a suffocating wilderness that stretched on forever. As dusk began to bleed into the sky, she heard a new sound, carried on the wind, a long, lonely cry that made the hair on her arms stand on end. Wolves. She had never heard a wolf before, but she knew the sound instantly. It was the voice of the wild, and it was a promise of death. Despair was a cold, heavy weight in her belly. The hope she had carried so carefully all the way from St. Louis was gone, lost in the mud with her shoe and her trunk. Amos Creed was just a name, a ghost in a land that was determined to swallow her whole. She was alone, stripped of everything, a nameless, lost thing in the heart of an immense and unforgiving world. She did not know if she walked for hours or for days. Time lost its meaning, measured only in the rhythm of pain and the slow draining of her strength. Hunger gnawed at her, a dull ache that joined the symphony of her other miseries. She drank from a stream, the water so cold it hurt her teeth, and she kept moving, a ghost in the rain. Her mind began to drift. She saw her mother's face, pale and smiling. Then the hard, resentful eyes of her stepmother. She thought of the simple warmth of a kitchen fire, the smell of baking bread, the feel of a dry blanket. They were memories from another life, a life that belonged to someone else. It was when she was certain she could not take another step, when the world was beginning to swim and fade at the edges, that she saw it, through a gap in the trees, in a small clearing on the slope of the mountain above her. A thin gray ribbon of smoke was rising into the sky. It was a fragile, impossible thing. For a moment, she believed she was imagining it, a final trick of a mind surrendering to exhaustion. But she blinked, and it was still there. Smoke. It meant fire. It meant shelter. It meant life. A current of new energy, born of desperation, coursed through her. She pushed herself up the incline, her hands grabbing at roots and rocks to pull herself forward. The clearing was 100 yards away, then 50, then 10. She could see it now, a small, sturdy cabin built of thick, dark logs, its roof covered in sod, a stone chimney breathing that life-giving smoke into the weeping sky. She stumbled out of the tree line and into the open, a broken, wretched creature. Her dress was in tatters, caked in mud. Her hair was a wild tangle, plastered to her face. Blood from her cut hands and bruised foot left faint, pinkish trails on her skin. She took a single, lurching step toward the cabin, her eyes fixed on the promise of its door. And then the world tilted, the gray sky and the dark logs swirling together into a black, silent void. Silas Ward was splitting wood when he first saw her. He had been alone for 10 years, and he preferred it that way. The company of the mountains was honest. They did not lie, and they did not make promises they could not keep. They simply were. People, in his experience, were different. He had come up here to this lonely slope after the fire, after he had buried what was left of his wife and his son. He had built this cabin with his own hands, and in doing so, had built a wall around his heart. He worked in a steady, powerful rhythm, the axe rising and falling, the clean crack of splitting pine the only sound besides the rain and the wind. He was a part of the landscape, big and rugged, with a thick beard that was more gray than brown and eyes the color of a winter sky. He felt the movement at the edge of the clearing before he saw it, a flicker of motion that did not belong. A deer, perhaps, or a bear driven down by the coming snows. He lowered his axe and stood perfectly still. His eyes narrowed. Then the figure emerged from the trees. It was no animal. It was a woman, or what was left of one. She was a specter, a thing of rags and mud, staggering as if she were already a ghost. He saw the bare foot, the torn dress, the way she shivered uncontrollably. His first instinct was suspicion. It was a hard, cold thing that had kept him alive. No one came this far up the mountain by accident. Trouble, like a wolf on a scent, had a way of finding the loneliest places. Was she a decoy? Was someone else waiting in the trees? He scanned the forest edge, his hand resting on the handle of the axe. He saw nothing but the dripping pines. He watched as she took one step, then another, her eyes locked on his cabin. He saw the moment her strength gave out, the way her body simply folded, collapsing into the wet grass with a final, defeated sigh. For a long moment, he did not move. Part of him, the hard, wounded part, wanted to turn away, to go back inside and bar the door. She was not his concern. The world below could keep its own sorrows. But then he saw the small, pale hand half buried in the mud, and he remembered another hand, small and warm, that had once held his. With a low curse, he dropped the axe and strode across the clearing. Up close, she was even worse than he had imagined. She was young, perhaps barely 20. Her face was streaked with dirt and tears, her lips blue with cold. Bruises, dark and ugly, were visible on her arms where her sleeve was torn. She was impossibly thin, as if she had not seen a decent meal in months. This was not a threat. This was a stray lamb, caught in a wolf trap. He knelt, and with a gentleness that would have surprised anyone who knew him, he slipped one arm under her shoulders and the other beneath her knees. She weighed almost nothing. As he lifted her, her head lolled against his chest, and a soft, broken sound escaped her lips. He carried her inside, kicking the heavy plank door shut against the wind. The cabin was a single room, dominated by a large stone fireplace where a fire crackled, casting a warm, flickering light on the rough-hewn walls. It was a Spartan space, holding only a bed frame with a mattress of pine boughs and furs, a sturdy table and chair, and shelves holding a few tin plates and provisions. The air smelled of wood smoke, drying herbs, and the faint, clean scent of pine resin. He laid her down on the thick bearskin rug before the hearth, the closest place to the warmth. He worked with a quiet efficiency, his movements economical and sure. He filled a kettle with water and set it on the hook over the fire. While it heated, he gently pried the sodden, ruined stocking from her right foot, his rough fingers hesitating as he saw the cuts and bruises. He took a clean cloth and a basin and began to carefully wash the mud and blood from her face and hands. Her skin was ashen, her breathing shallow and uneven. As he cleaned a cut on her palm, his fingers brushed against a lump inside her bodice. Frowning, he carefully worked it free. It was a letter, soaked through and fragile. He handled it with care, unfolding the damp pages near the firelight. It was an agreement, a formal, business-like contract between a Mr. Amos Creed of the settlement of Three Forks and a Miss Clara Holt of St. Louis. The words were plain: passage paid, a promise of marriage upon arrival. Silas read the name Amos Creed, and his jaw tightened. He knew Creed. Not well, but he knew him. Creed was a loud man who spent more time in the saloon than on his homestead. A man whose laughter was always a little too sharp, whose eyes were always a little too greedy. Silas had seen him in town once, arguing with a freighter over a gambling debt. He was not the sort of man Silas would ever trust, and this girl, this broken child on his floor, had crossed half a continent for him. He looked from the letter back to her face, peaceful now in the firelight, and a feeling he had not felt in 10 years stirred within him. It was a bitter, unwelcome pity. He had a duty now. A responsibility had stumbled to his door and collapsed on his hearth, and he could not turn it away. Clara drifted in and out of consciousness. She was aware of warmth, a feeling she thought she had lost forever. She felt a gentle touch on her face, a soft cloth wiping away the grime. A voice, low and rumbling like distant thunder, spoke, but she could not grasp the words. She was floating in a safe, dark place, and she did not want to leave it. Later, she awoke more fully. The fire was a warm, golden eye in the darkness. She was lying on something soft, covered by a heavy fur blanket that smelled of smoke and winter. The large, bearded man was sitting at the table, watching her. In the dim light, he looked like one of the mountains himself, broad and solid and ancient. Fear flickered in her, but it was a dull, exhausted thing. She was too tired for fear. He saw her eyes were open and rose. Moving to the hearth, he ladled something warm from a pot into a wooden bowl. "Broth," he said. His voice was rough, unused. "Drink it." He helped her sit up, propping her against a rolled-up fur. The broth was thin, but it was hot, and the taste of salt and meat was the most wonderful thing she had ever known. She drank it slowly, her hands trembling as she held the bowl. When she was finished, he took the bowl from her and set it aside. They sat in silence for a long time. The only sounds, the crackle of the fire and the rising moan of the wind outside. "My trunk," she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. "My things." "There was nothing," he said, his tone flat. "Just you." The finality of his words settled over her. It was all gone. "You are on Silas Ward's land," he continued, as if reciting a list of facts. "The letter I found said you were bound for Amos Creed's homestead. 3 Forks is a day's journey down the mountain. When the weather clears," he paused, looking toward the single window, where darkness pressed against the glass. "When you are strong enough, I will take you there." It was a simple promise, a statement of intent, yet it felt like a sentence. She had survived, only to be delivered to a fate she no longer had the heart to face. She said nothing, only nodded, and let him help her lie back down. She closed her eyes, and the darkness took her again. Later that night, the rain turned to snow, the first of the season. Great, silent flakes drifted down, blanketing the clearing, covering the tracks of her desperate arrival, muffling the world in a shroud of white. Silas sat by the fire, oiling his rifle, the familiar motions a comfort. He could not sleep. The woman's quiet breathing was a foreign sound in the cabin, a disruption to the deep, silent solitude he had cultivated for a decade. He looked over at her. In the soft firelight, the harsh lines of exhaustion had softened on her face. She looked young and terribly vulnerable. She stirred in her sleep, her brow furrowed. A small sound escaped her lips, a broken, mournful whisper that was almost lost in the crackle of the flames. "I only had one shoe left." The words were so full of loss, so simple and so sad, that they found a crack in the wall he had built around his heart. He stopped his work, his hands still. He looked at her, this piece of human wreckage washed up at his door, and he thought of her journey, of the mud and the terror and the utter desolation of losing everything, right down to a single, worn shoe. He did not realize he was going to speak. The words came on their own, a quiet reply to her sleeping sorrow, a promise spoken only to the fire and the falling snow. "Then I'll carry you the rest of the way." The world Clara woke to was white and silent. Sometime in the night, the rain had given its soul to the cold, and a deep blanket of snow now covered everything. It clung to the pines, weighed down their branches, and rose in soft drifts against the cabin's single, oil-paper window, turning the light that filtered through into a pale, ethereal glow. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, she was not cold, she was not wet, she was not afraid. She was simply still. Days settled into a quiet, spare rhythm, dictated not by a clock, but by the sun and the needs of survival. Silas Ward moved through this rhythm with a mechanical precision that was both fascinating and unsettling. He rose in the darkness before dawn, the scrape of his boots on the floorboards the first sound of the day. He would tend the fire, his large frame casting long, dancing shadows, then pull on a heavy coat of buffalo hide and disappear into the white world outside. His rifle in hand, he would return hours later, silent as his own shadow, sometimes with a pair of rabbits to be skinned, sometimes empty-handed, his face grim and unreadable. He kept his distance. The small cabin, barely 15 paces from one wall to the other, became a vast territory of unspoken boundaries. He spoke little, and when he did, his words were like stones dropped into a deep well, functional, heavy, and gone without a ripple. "The water bucket is there. Eat!" More wood for the fire. He rarely looked directly at her, his gaze always fixed on some point just over her shoulder. As if she were a ghost he was trying not to see. Clara, in turn, moved cautiously through his world, her body healed slowly. The cuts on her hands and foot scabbed over, and the deep, aching exhaustion in her bones began to recede, replaced by a quiet strength. But a part of her felt adrift, suspended between a past that had been violently erased and a future that loomed like a dark storm cloud. This cabin, this small pocket of warmth and safety, was a place that belonged to neither. She could not bear the weight of his charity, of being a useless mouth to feed. As her strength returned, she began to claim small duties for herself. She found his meager sack of flour and, using a little salt pork from a barrel, made a serviceable stew to go with the rabbit meat. The first time she offered him a bowl, he stared at it for a long moment, his expression unreadable, before taking it with a short, clipped nod that was the closest thing to thanks he could offer. But he ate every last bit. The cabin itself was his story, written in axe marks and sturdy joinery. The logs were massive, hand-hewn and notched with a skill that spoke of patience and immense strength. The gaps were chinked with a mixture of mud and dried moss, sealing out the relentless wind. It was a fortress built against the world, filled with the clean, sharp scent of pine resin that seemed to seep from the very walls, mingled with the constant, comforting smell of wood smoke. Everything had a purpose: the row of pegs for his coat and traps, the rough-hewn shelves holding tins of coffee and beans, the solid plank table he had built himself. It was a man's space, stark and practical. Yet, there were ghosts here. On a high shelf, just below the rafters, sat a small wooden bird, crudely but lovingly carved, its wings half spread. By the door, a single wooden peg was set much lower than the others, at the right height for a child's coat. These small details spoke of a life that had once filled this empty space, of a silence that had not always been so absolute. One afternoon, while Silas was out checking his trap lines, Clara found a small wooden box containing a sewing kit. Inside were needles, a thimble, and spools of coarse thread. She took down one of his shirts, a heavy flannel garment with a long tear in the sleeve, sitting by the fire, with the wind whining outside. She began to mend it. The act was simple, domestic. She pulled the torn edges together, her small, neat stitches, a stark contrast to the rough weave of the fabric. She was holding something that belonged to him, something that lay against his skin. She could almost feel the warmth of his body in the heavy cloth, and a strange, unfamiliar blush rose to her cheeks. He returned as dusk was falling, a gust of frigid air following him through the door. He paused when he saw her with the shirt in her hands, his body going unnaturally still. She held it up, a silent offering. "The sleeve was torn," she said, her voice small in the quiet room. He did not take it. He simply stared at the neat line of her stitches, his jaw tight. For a moment, she thought she had angered him, had crossed some invisible line. He took off his snow-covered coat and hung it on its peg. He moved to the fire, warming his raw, chapped hands. "My wife, Sarah," he said, his back to her, his voice a low rumble. "She used to mend my shirts." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with the weight of 10 winters. Clara lowered the shirt to her lap, her heart aching for this broken, solitary man. She understood now that his silence was not a rejection of her, but a shield for himself. "I'm sorry," she whispered. He shook his head, a short, sharp gesture. "Sorry does not put things back." He finally turned to face her, his eyes holding a bleakness that chilled her more than the wind. "You want to know about this place? I will tell you. I built it with my own 2 hands, for her and for our boy, Daniel. We had 3 years. Then one night, a lamp overturned. The fire, it moved so fast." He looked away, toward the dark window. "I was out, checking on a sick horse. By the time I got back, it was too late. I buried them both on the hill behind this cabin. The mountains keep secrets. Miss Holt, they take what they want, and they give nothing back. Remember that." After that, the silence between them changed. It was still there, but it was no longer empty. It was filled with a shared understanding of loss, a fragile bridge built between his raw, gaping wound and the fresh scars of her own. As her body healed, her mind began to torment her. The name Amos Creed, which had once been a symbol of hope, now filled her with a creeping dread. She remembered the strange, possessive tone of his letters. In the last one, he had written, "A wife is a reflection of her husband's authority. I expect you to be mindful of that duty, and to be obedient in all things." At the time, she had dismissed it as the formal language of a man unused to writing. Now, the words felt like a collar tightening around her neck. She tried to ask Silas about him, her questions veiled in politeness. "Is the settlement of Three Forks a large place, Mr. Ward?" she asked one evening as they ate their meal in near silence. "It is a place," he answered, not looking up from his bowl. "And Mr. Creed, do you know him well?" He stopped eating. He raised his eyes to hers, and, for the first time, he held her gaze. His eyes were clear and cold as ice. "I know of him," he said slowly. "He keeps to the saloon more than his homestead. A man with loud words and quick hands." The way he said it, the quiet darkness in his voice, confirmed every fear she had. Silas sensed it too. He was a man who lived by reading signs, the snap of a twig, the shift in the wind, the look in a predator's eye. He could see the terror that lay just beneath her calm facade, a deep, shadowy thing that had nothing to do with bandits or the wilderness. The weather, as if sensing the turmoil inside the cabin, turned vicious. The snow began to fall again, thick and heavy, and the wind rose to a primal scream. For 3 days, a blizzard raged, erasing the world beyond the cabin walls. They were trapped, sealed in the small, fire-lit space, as if they were the only 2 people left on Earth. The wind howled like a legion of grieving souls, and the sturdy log walls of the cabin groaned under the assault. There were no more chores to be done outside, no escape from each other's presence. The space between them shrank until it was almost unbearable. They moved around each other like wary dancers, their shoulders sometimes brushing, a jolt of unexpected warmth passing between them. The tension was a living thing in the room, a mix of her gratitude and his reluctance, all tangled up with an unspoken awareness that vibrated in the close air. On the second night of the storm, the confinement and the relentless sound of the wind tore through the thin veil of Clara's composure. She fell into a troubled sleep and found herself back in the muddy pass, the stagecoach splintering around her, the shouts, the fear, the cold mud sucking at her skin. It was all terrifyingly real. A man with cruel eyes and a dirty kerchief grabbed her. His face was a blur, but his hands were not. He ripped her trunk away, and then, as she tried to scramble free, His fingers tangled in her hair. It was not a violent pull. It was a slow, appraising touch, as if he were judging the quality of a horse. It was the last thing she remembered before she broke free and ran. She cried out in her sleep, a thin, terrified sound. "No, please, let go!" Silas was awake instantly, his hand reaching for the rifle that always leaned against the wall by his bed. He sat up, his senses on high alert, listening to the roar of the wind. Then he heard her again, a soft, whimpering sob. He saw her thrashing on her pallet of furs, her hands pushing at something that was not there. His first instinct was to do nothing. Her dreams were her own. He was her rescuer, not her guardian. He had promised to take her to Creed, and that was where his duty ended. He lay back down, pulling his blanket up to his chin, turning his back to her, but her quiet, broken sobs continued. Small, wounded sounds in the vast, howling darkness. They pierced through the armor he had worn for 10 years. With a deep, frustrated sigh, he rose from his bed. The floor was cold beneath his bare feet. He crossed the small room and knelt beside her. Her face was pale in the firelight, her eyes squeezed shut, tears tracking clean paths through the faint grime on her cheeks. She was so small, so utterly broken. He did not know what to do. The language of comfort was foreign to him, a tongue he had forgotten how to speak. He hesitated, his large hand hovering in the air above her. Then, slowly, he reached out and gently laid his hand over hers where it lay clenched on the fur blanket. His hand was huge, completely engulfing hers. It was rough and calloused from a lifetime of hard labor, the skin thick and scarred, but the touch was incredibly gentle. It was not a gesture of passion or pity. It was simply a point of anchor in a storm, a solid, warm presence in the terrifying darkness of her dream. At his touch, Clara went still. Her sobbing quieted. She did not wake, but her breathing deepened, and the tension seemed to drain from her body. Her fingers uncurled slightly, resting against his palm. Silas knelt there for a long time, his hand covering hers, listening to the storm rage outside and the woman's quiet breathing inside. For the first time in a decade, he was not entirely alone in his fortress of solitude. A crack had appeared in the wall. Outside, somewhere in the white maelstrom, a wolf howled, a long, lonely cry that was answered by another, farther away. The sound was wild and mournful, a perfect echo of the desolation in his own heart. But tonight, for the first time, it sounded a little less lonely. The storm ended as suddenly as it began. The next morning, the sun rose in a sky of brilliant, cloudless blue. The light reflecting off the fresh snow was blinding. The world was new and clean, reborn in silence and ice. The trail down the mountain would still be impassable for a day or two, but the end of their confinement was in sight. The future, which had been held at bay by the blizzard, was once again waiting for them. Silas stood at the open cabin door, looking out at the transformed landscape. The air was so cold it felt sharp in his lungs. Clara came to stand a few feet behind him, wrapping a worn blanket around her shoulders. "It is beautiful," she said softly. He nodded, his eyes on the valley below, where the settlement of Three Forks lay hidden under the snow. "The trail will be clear enough tomorrow, or the day after," he said, his voice flat again. The wall around him rebuilt. "I will take you to Creed's homestead then." He spoke the words of his promise, the duty he was bound to, but as he said them, Clara saw something flicker in his eyes as they met hers for a brief second. It was a deep, profound hesitation, a silent question that neither of them dared to ask. He was going to deliver her to her future, but for the first time, it felt less like a rescue and more like a surrender. The morning air was sharp as broken glass. 2 days after the blizzard, the world was scoured clean, the sky a high, aching blue. Inside the cabin, a heavy silence had fallen, more profound than the quiet of the storm. It was the silence of an ending. Silas moved with a grim purpose, checking the straps on his saddle, his face a mask of stone. He was a man marching toward a duty he now loathed, and every methodical gesture was an act of self-punishment. He had saddled Bess, his big, steady mare, who snorted plumes of steam into the frigid air. There was no second horse. The plan was simple. Clara would ride, and he would walk, leading them down the mountain to the life that awaited her. To him, Clara stood by the door, a small, lost figure. She had nothing to pack, nothing to carry away from this temporary haven. She wore a pair of Silas's old woolen trousers, cinched at the waist with a piece of rope, and a spare flannel shirt that swallowed her small frame. On her feet were a pair of his winter moccasins, stuffed with rags to keep them from falling off. She was dressed in the borrowed identity of the man who was leading her away. She took one last look at the cabin's interior, the stone hearth that had given her warmth, the rough-hewn table where she had shared silent meals, the bearskin rug where she had woken from a nightmare to find a steadying hand on hers. It was the safest place she had ever known, and she was leaving it. Silas did not look at her. "It is time," he said, his voice a low gravel. He helped her mount the horse, his hand strong and impersonal on her waist as he lifted her into the saddle. The brief touch was like a brand, a searing point of contact in the cold air. Then he turned, took the reins in his hand, and began to walk. They left the clearing without a backward glance, two solitary figures moving through a vast and silent world of white. The journey down was a descent into a world of breathtaking, merciless beauty. The snow on the high pines flashed and glittered in the sun, each branch a filigree of ice and light, long, wicked icicles, like daggers of glass, hung from the rock outcroppings. The only sounds were the crunch of Silas's boots in the snow, the soft plodding of the mare, and the whisper of the wind through the high, lonely peaks. The silence was immense, an echo of the emptiness that had settled in Clara's heart. She felt as though she were being led through a beautiful, frozen cathedral to her own sacrifice. They walked for hours. Silas was a relentless, silent engine, his broad back a wall between her and the world. The silence stretched and tightened until Clara felt she would scream. She had to break it. She had to make him understand. "My father was a watchmaker," she said, her voice thin in the vast quiet. Silas gave no sign he had heard, but his stride did not falter. She pressed on, needing to fill the emptiness with words. He was a kind man, quiet. He could spend a whole day with his loupe in his eye, fixing the tiny wheels and gears. He used to say that everything, no matter how broken, could be set right with patience. She paused, watching the steady rhythm of his walking. "When he died, everything changed. My stepmother. She was not a cruel woman, not in the way people think of cruelty. She never raised a hand to me, but she made me invisible. I slept in a cot in the scullery. I ate what was left after they had finished their meals. I was the first to rise and the last to sleep. My hands were always in dishwater or lye soap. My father's friends would visit and look right through me, as if I were just another part of the furniture." Silas's shoulders seemed to tighten, the muscles in his back bunching under his heavy coat. He said nothing. "One day," Clara continued, her voice trembling slightly, "I saw an advertisement in the newspaper, a matrimonial advertisement. It spoke of land, of building a new life in the West. I did not know the man's name. Not then. I only knew he was offering a way out, a chance to be a person again, not a ghost. So I answered it. Mr. Creed's letters. They were not warm, but they were a promise of a life that was mine." She fell silent, her confession laid bare in the cold mountain air. She had not come west for love or adventure. She had come west to escape a slow, quiet death of the spirit. "I am frightened of him, Mr. Ward," she finally whispered, the admission costing her the last of her pride. His letters grew strange. He wrote of a wife's duty. He wrote that he had paid good money for my passage and expected a return on his investment. It sounded as if he were purchasing livestock. Silas stopped. He did not turn around, but his body was rigid. For a long moment, the only sound was the mare's soft breathing. He was a man caught between a promise he had made and a truth he could no longer ignore. His duty was a straight, hard line leading down the mountain, but his heart, a thing he had thought long dead, was pulling him back. He was leading this girl, this survivor, to a man he had knew was poison. The guilt was a physical weight, heavier than his rifle, heavier than his pack. Without a word, he started walking again, his pace faster now, as if he could outrun the conflict raging inside him. They reached the lower slopes as the afternoon sun began to cast long, blue shadows across the snow. The settlement of Three Forks was a scattered collection of rough buildings in the distance, but Creed's homestead was set apart, closer to the base of the mountain. It was a miserable sight. A sagging rail fence enclosed a yard of churned mud and snow, littered with broken barrels and discarded tools. A gaunt-looking hound, its ribs stark against its hide, was chained to a post on the porch, and it gave a low, dispirited growl as they approached. The house itself was little more than a shack, with tar paper patching holes in the roof and a chimney that leaked a greasy, black smoke. A man emerged from the house as they drew near. He was the opposite of Silas in every way. Where Silas was lean and hard, this man was fleshy and soft, his belly straining the buttons of a dirty red union suit. His face was puffy and unshaven, his eyes small and shrewd. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and grinned, a humorless expression that showed stained teeth. "Well now," he boomed, his voice thick with drink. "Look what the mountain cat dragged in. It is about time. I was beginning to think you got lost. Girl." This was Amos Creed. He ignored Silas completely, his eyes roaming over Clara with a look of open appraisal, like a man judging a horse he was about to buy. "Get down from there," he ordered. Clara froze in the saddle, her hands clutching the pommel. Silas stepped forward, placing a hand on the mare's bridle. He looked at Creed, his face impassive. "She was in a stagecoach ambush," Silas said, his voice level and cold. "Lost her things. She has been through an ordeal." Creed laughed, a short, ugly bark. "An ordeal? We all got ordeals. Mountain man. I had the ordeal of paying her passage and waiting 2 weeks longer than I ought. She is my property now. I paid for her. What happens to her is my concern, not yours." He finally turned his dismissive gaze to Silas. "I appreciate you delivering my goods, but your business here is done. Go on back to your rocks and your squirrels." He reached up and grabbed Clara's arm, his fingers digging into her flesh. "Come on, girl. The house will not clean itself." And in that moment, something inside Silas Ward snapped. The restraint he had held for 10 years, the tight, cold control he had wrapped around his grief and his rage, shattered into 1,000 pieces. He moved with a speed that was terrifying in a man his size. He dropped the reins and his hands shot out, grabbing the front of Creed's shirt and ripping him away from Clara. "Do not," Silas snarled, his voice a low, dangerous sound that was more animal than human. "Put your hands on her." Creed stumbled back, surprised by the sudden violence, but he recovered quickly, his face twisting into a mask of fury. "You dare? In my own yard?" He lunged, his fists swinging wildly. The fight was not a display of skill. It was a raw, brutal, and desperate explosion of violence. It was the clash of two kinds of men, one hardened by nature and grief, the other softened by drink and cruelty. Creed fought like a cornered animal, with kicks and gouging thumbs. But Silas fought with the pure, focused rage of a man who had lost everything and had just found something he was not willing to lose. He took a glancing blow to the cheek that split the skin, and another to the mouth that filled his throat with the coppery taste of blood. But his own fists landed with the force of falling trees. He drove Creed back across the porch, the sound of their bodies hitting the wall of the shack like a muffled drumbeat. A porch rail splintered under their combined weight. A man, one of Creed's hired hands, appeared in the doorway, his eyes wide, but he made no move to intervene. The fight ended as quickly as it began. Silas landed a final, heavy blow to Creed's jaw, and the man crumpled, sliding down the wall to sit in a heap in the dirty snow, dazed and groaning. Silence fell, broken only by the ragged sound of Silas's breathing. He stood over Creed, his chest heaving, his fists clenched and bleeding. The rage drained out of him, leaving behind a cold, hollow shame. He had not struck another man in 10 years. The violence felt like a violation of his own solitude, a stain on the quiet grief he had nursed for so long. He turned away, his face bloodied and silent, looking like a stranger to himself. Clara scrambled down from the horse, her heart pounding. She rushed to Silas's side, ignoring the pathetic moans of the man on the ground. She reached out a trembling hand, her fingers hovering just over the cut on his cheek. "Silas," she begged, her voice thick with tears. "Please, take me with you. Please do not leave me here." He looked at her, and his eyes were filled with a terrible pain. It was the pain of a man who felt he had failed completely. He had failed to protect her by bringing her here, and he had failed himself by succumbing to a brute violence he despised. He was burdened by a deep, crushing guilt and a fierce, stubborn pride. "I cannot make that choice for you, Clara," he said, his voice rough and strained. "I have no right. Look at me. I live like a wild animal. I have nothing to offer you but a cold cabin and a hard life. This is supposed to be your home, a place in the world. I cannot take that from you. The path you walk has to be your own." He was not rejecting her. He was giving her something no one else ever had, a choice, the freedom to decide her own fate, no matter how bleak the options were. Clara looked from his bruised and bleeding face to the squalid shack behind him. She looked at Amos Creed, who was now being helped to his feet by his hired man, spitting blood and curses into the snow. She saw her future laid out before her, a life of servitude to a cruel, drunken bully, a slow withering of her soul in this filthy, loveless place. Then she looked back at Silas. He offered nothing but hardship, a life on the edge of the world. But in his eyes, she saw a flicker of the same fierce, protective loyalty she had seen in the heart of a blizzard. He had bled for her. Her decision was made in an instant. It was not a choice between a bad life and a good one. It was a choice between death and life, between a cage and the wild, terrifying freedom of the mountains. Without a word, she bent down and untied the laces of the moccasins. She pulled them from her feet, the warm, soft hide a final link to the life she was leaving behind. She placed them gently on the snow-covered ground. Then she took a step, her bare foot sinking into the biting cold of the snow. The shock of it was a jolt, a sharp, clean pain that felt like a baptism. She walked past the horse, past the stunned hired hand who stared at her as if she were a lunatic, and stopped in front of Silas. She did not need to say a word. Her action was her answer. She had chosen him. She had chosen the mountains. She had chosen to walk a hard path, barefoot, rather than stand on the tainted ground of Amos Creed's homestead. She had arrived in this land with only one shoe. She would leave this place with none, having shed the last vestiges of the woman she was supposed to be. And as Silas looked down at her, standing there in the snow, defiant and terrified and brave, he knew the promise he had whispered to her in the dark had just become his destiny. The journey back up the mountain was a silent pilgrimage. For the first 100 yards, Clara walked, her bare feet leaving pale, fleeting prints in the snow. The pain was a sharp, clarifying thing, a penance and a declaration all at once. But Silas, his face a bloodied mask of grim resolve, stopped abruptly. He turned, his eyes dark with an emotion she could not name, and without a word, he lifted her as if she were a child and set her back upon the horse. He then took the reins and continued the ascent, his broad shoulders set against the world, a man hauling the consequences of his choice up a mountain of his own making. They were fugitives now, not just from the petty cruelty of one man, but from the law he could buy and the gossip he could spread. When they finally reached the cabin, it was no longer just a shelter. It was a fortress, a hideout, their last bastion against a world that had branded them outlaws. The door closed behind them, shutting out the wind and the fading light, and they were left in a silence thick with unspoken questions. They had made a choice in a moment of violent clarity, and now they had to live with it, day by day, in the confines of this small room. The companionship that grew between them was an uneasy, fragile thing. They were two planets forced into a shared orbit, intensely aware of each other's gravity, terrified of a collision. The simple routines of survival became a complex dance of avoidance and awareness. Who would fetch the water? Who would stir the stew? Every shared task, every accidental touch, was charged with a current of unspoken meaning. Weeks passed. The deep winter held the mountain in its grip. One day, Silas announced he was going to a trading post for salt and flour. Not Three Forks, but a place 2 days' ride to the north, a place where his face was not known. He was gone for 5 days, and in his absence, the silence of the cabin became a crushing weight. Clara realized with a start that she was more afraid of being alone than she had ever been of him. When he returned, a grimness clung to him like the cold. He dropped the sacks of supplies on the table and stood by the fire, his back to her. "A trapper was at the post," he said, his voice flat. "He came up from the south." Clara waited, her hands clutching the edge of the table. "The story is all over the valley," he continued, his gaze fixed on the flames. "They are saying the mountain man, Silas Ward, went mad, that he stole Amos Creed's intended bride, beat him half to death, and dragged her back to his lair like a wild animal." The words were ugly, twisting the truth into a monstrous shape. Clara felt a flush of shame, hot and sickening. "That is not what happened." "It does not matter," Silas said, finally turning to look at her, his eyes bleak. "It is the story that will be told." The rumor was a wall, sealing them in together, making the cabin their entire world. The gossip that was meant to isolate him now bound her to him. Outside these log walls, they were a monster and his prize. Inside, they were just a man and a woman, trying to learn how to live. In the face of this, something hardened in Clara. She was not a prize. She was not a victim to be dragged. She was a woman who had walked barefoot in the snow. She began to rebuild herself, not with bricks and mortar, but with purpose. She refused to be a guest in his life any longer. She started with the wood pile. At first, she only gathered kindling, but she watched Silas, the easy, powerful swing of his axe, the way he read the grain of a log before striking. One morning, she picked up the small hand axe. It was heavier than she expected. Her first few swings were clumsy, glancing off the wood. Silas came out, his face set in a frown. "That is not work for a woman," he said, his voice gruff. "I am not made of glass." "Mr. Ward," she replied, her chin set stubbornly. "I mean to earn my keep." He watched her struggle for another moment, then let out a heavy sigh. He took the axe from her, his calloused fingers brushing against hers. "No," he said, "your stance is wrong. You will put the axe through your foot. Here, like this." He stood behind her, his large frame encompassing hers, and guided her hands, showing her how to hold the axe, how to use the weight of it, how to let it do the work. The lesson was practical, but his closeness, the warmth of his body against her back, sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the cold. She learned to split wood, and with every clean crack of the axe, she felt a little stronger, a little more herself. She turned her attention to the cabin's interior. It was his space, but it was her world now, too. She found a bundle of old flour sacks in a storage chest, washed them until they were soft and clean, and painstakingly sewed them into simple curtains for the window. When she hung them, the pale fabric softened the harsh afternoon light, transforming the room from a stark shelter into something that felt like a home. Silas said nothing when he saw them, but she saw the way his eyes lingered on them, a flicker of surprise in their depths. In a small crate, she found some of his wife's things, packed away but not discarded. There were a few hardy, dried herbs on a narrow ledge by the window that caught the morning sun. She placed a small pot of earth and planted them. It was a desperate, hopeful act, an attempt to make something grow in the heart of winter. The intimacy between them grew not in leaps and bounds, but in inches, in moments as quiet and fragile as a falling snowflake. It was in the way he began to leave a tin mug of hot, sweetened coffee for her by the hearth in the mornings. It was in the way she learned to patch his clothes, her needle moving with a swift, sure grace that he would watch from the corner of his eye. One evening, a log shifted in the fireplace, sending a shower of sparks onto the hearth. One ember landed perilously close to the bearskin rug. They both moved at once, colliding in a clumsy scramble to brush it away. For a moment, they were a tangle of limbs, his hard shoulder against hers, her hand pressed against his chest. They pulled apart quickly, their faces flushed, and then a small sound escaped Clara's lips, a short, surprised laugh. Silas looked at her, his expression startled, and then a slow, rusty sound rumbled in his own chest. It was the first time either of them had laughed. The sound was so foreign, so loud in the quiet cabin, that it shocked them both into a wide-eyed silence. But a wall had been breached. Their love story was written in these quiet moments, in glances held a fraction of a second too long, in the shared warmth of two mugs held in calloused hands near a dying fire, in the unspoken comfort of another's soul breathing in the darkness. The turning point came on a night when the wind howled a lonely song around the eaves of the cabin. The fight with Creed had torn Silas's favorite shirt, and Clara sat by the fire, mending it for a second time. She worked by the flickering light, her stitches small and even, to get a better angle on the tear near his elbow. She had asked him to take off the garment, and he sat at the table in his undershirt, cleaning his rifle. As he reached for a cleaning cloth, the firelight caught his forearm, and for the first time, she saw them. The scars. They were not the fresh, clean cuts from the fight. These were old, deep, and ugly. A latticework of silvery, puckered skin that covered a large portion of his arm, a permanent testament to a terrible heat. She knew, with a certainty that made her breath catch, that these were the scars from the fire that had taken his family. They were the reason he hid himself from the world. She stopped sewing. Her needle hovered in midair. He felt her gaze and looked up, his own eyes following hers down to his arm. He instinctively tried to pull it back into the shadows, a gesture of deep, ingrained shame. "Do not," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. She put the shirt aside and rose from her stool, moving to kneel on the floor beside his chair. He sat rigid, a trapped animal. As she reached out a tentative hand, her fingers, small and gentle, hovered over the scarred skin. He flinched, but did not pull away. With a feather-light touch, she traced the edge of a long, jagged scar that ran from his wrist to his elbow. She was touching the source of his pain, the physical manifestation of the wound on his soul. The air crackled with a tension so thick it felt hard to breathe. His voice, when he spoke, was a raw, broken rasp. "I have not let another soul touch me, not since that night, not in 10 years. His confession was a stone dropped into the absolute stillness of the room. He was admitting his utter isolation, the depth of the fortress he had built around himself. Clara looked up at him, her eyes shining in the firelight. She saw not the fearsome mountain man of the town's gossip, but a man drowning in a grief so profound he had forgotten how to breathe. She whispered back, her voice thick with an emotion so powerful it was almost painful. "You just did." He looked at her, confused, thinking she meant her touch on his arm, but she shook her head slightly. Her eyes holding his, she meant the fight. She meant the way he had reached into her life, had touched her fate and pulled her from the fire of her own. He had touched her, and in doing so, had allowed himself to be touched in return. Understanding dawned in his eyes. The fortress crumbled. The walls that had stood for a decade, built of grief and guilt and loneliness, came crashing down. He reached out, his scarred hand trembling, and cupped her cheek. His thumb stroked her skin, a touch of reverent wonder. The wind howled outside, but inside, there was only the sound of their shared breath. That night marked the beginning. There were no grand declarations of love, no flowery promises. Their coming together was as quiet and natural as the turning of a season, a silent, hesitant affirmation of life in a place that had long been consecrated to death. It was a desperate, gentle solace, two lost souls finding shelter in each other's arms while the storm raged outside. But the morning light brought with it the ghosts of their past. As they lay in the quiet of the dawn, the new, fragile intimacy between them was shadowed by old fears. Clara felt a deep, pervasive sense of unworthiness. She was damaged goods, a mail-order bride who had brought nothing but violence and scandal to this man's door. She had tainted his solitude, made him a fugitive. How could he truly want someone like her? Shame was a cold companion, whispering that she was a burden he had been forced to bear. Silas, for his part, felt as though he had committed a great betrayal. Happiness, he had long believed, was a country from which he had been permanently exiled. To feel it now seemed like a trespass on the memory of his wife and son. He felt damned, as if this fragile joy was a fleeting, forbidden thing that would be ripped away from him, a cruel joke played by a merciless God. He would watch Clara as she moved about the cabin, a knot of fear tightening in his chest. He could not lose this. Too, he could not survive it a second time. Their love grew in this contested ground, a wildflower pushing up through a crack in the rock, beautiful but perpetually at risk. And then, as the grip of winter finally began to loosen, the world intruded. The snows began to melt, the sound of dripping water a constant rhythm beneath the eaves. The streams, long silent under the ice, began to whisper and then to roar. The first hardy mountain birds began to sing in the high branches of the pines. It was the season of thaw, of new life, of hope. One bright, cold afternoon, Silas was chopping wood, the rhythmic crack of his axe echoing in the clearing. Clara was inside, kneading dough for bread. She glanced out the window and froze. On the ridge opposite the cabin, a figure on horseback was silhouetted against the bright blue sky. He was not a trapper. He did not carry the tools of that trade. He sat still for a long moment, a dark sentinel surveying their hidden valley. Silas stopped his work, his hand resting on the axe handle. He had seen him, too. The man on the ridge slowly raised a hand, not in greeting, but to point directly at their cabin. Then, he turned his horse and disappeared back over the rise. It was a message. They had been found. A knot of dread tightened in Clara's stomach. The fragile peace of their world had been shattered. The thaw had not just brought the promise of spring. It had cleared the way for the world below to climb back up. 2 days later, the threat took form. Another rider appeared, this one coming directly up the path to their clearing. He was a lanky man with a drooping mustache whom Clara recognized as the hired hand from Creed's homestead. He stopped his horse a respectful distance from the cabin and did not dismount. Silas emerged from the cabin, his rifle held loosely in one hand, and stood on the porch, waiting. "Ward," the man called out, his voice nervous. "I ain't here for trouble." Silas said nothing, his face grim. The man reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He held it up. Amos Creed swore out a complaint with the territorial marshal, assault, and another for abducting his legal bride. He squinted at the paper. "This here is a warrant for your arrest." The warrant was a death sentence written on a piece of paper. The instant the hired man turned his horse and retreated down the trail, the fragile peace of their world evaporated. There was no discussion, no time for deliberation. Silas turned from the porch, his face carved from granite, his eyes burning with a cold, clear fire. The time for hiding was over. The time for running had begun. "Pack," he said, his voice a low command that cut through Clara's fear. "Food, blankets, the axe, only what we can carry on our backs. We leave in 10 minutes. The frantic moments that followed were a blur of desperate activity. Clara moved through the cabin, the home she had so carefully crafted, and saw only things they had to leave behind. The curtains she had sewn, the pot of herbs on the windowsill, the worn bearskin rug. It was all ballast to be cast overboard from a sinking ship. She stuffed hard biscuits, dried venison, and a small sack of coffee into a canvas pack. Silas took his rifle, his axe, a tinderbox, and a long coil of rope. He worked with a brutal efficiency, his every movement stripped of sentiment. To survive, they had to become as hard as the mountains themselves. They left the cabin door swinging open to the wind, a ghost house full of warm ashes and abandoned hope. Silas did not lead them down the mountain toward the world of men and laws. He led them up, into the high, treacherous country, the broken spine of the world where only he knew the secret paths. They climbed into a landscape of rock and ice, a place the spring thaw had not yet touched. They were running not to a destination, but away from one, becoming phantoms in the merciless wilderness. The mountains, which had once been a backdrop of breathtaking beauty, now became their primary adversary. The beauty was still there, in the sharp, crystalline air and the vast, silent amphitheaters of snow, but it was a cold, predatory beauty. The wilderness turned cruel. One afternoon, a low, guttural rumble from the slopes above them grew into a deafening roar. Silas tackled Clara, throwing them both behind a granite outcropping as a river of snow. Ice and rock thundered past, its power so immense it shook the very ground beneath them. The avalanche was a stark reminder that the mountains could kill without malice, simply by shrugging their great, white shoulders. The spring thaw in the lower valleys had turned the streams into raging torrents. They came to a river, a churning artery of gray, ice-choked water that barred their path. There was no bridge, no easy crossing. "We go through," Silas said, his jaw tight. He tied the rope around Clara's waist and then his own, a tether that bound their fates together. The water was a physical blow, a liquid cold so intense it stole the breath and numbed the bone. The current tore at them, the slippery rocks threatening to betray their footing with every step. Clara cried out as her feet went from under her, but Silas held firm, a human anchor against the river's fury, and dragged her to the other side. They collapsed on the far bank, shivering and gasping, alive but diminished. Worst of all was the hunger. The food they had carried ran out. The high country was barren, a desert of snow and rock. Game was scarce. Silas, a master of the hunt in his own woods, became a desperate gambler, spending hours tracking the faintest signs of life, often returning with nothing. The hunger was a slow, grinding enemy. It hollowed out their cheeks, dulled their eyes, and gnawed at their strength, leaving them weak and irritable. The world shrank to the size of an empty belly. One night, after a day of fruitless hunting had left them cold and despairing, they found shelter in a shallow cave carved into a cliff face by ancient winds. It was little more than a scoop in the rock, but it offered a reprieve from the relentless wind. They built a small, smoky fire of alpine scrub and huddled together, sharing the warmth of a single, damp blanket. In the flickering light, their faces were pale and strained, their shared ordeal etching new lines around their eyes and mouths. In the desperate intimacy of that cave, their bond, already forged in violence and fear, grew fierce and unbreakable. There was no room for pride or pretense. There was only the raw, elemental need for another human soul. "Sometimes," Clara whispered into the darkness, her voice thin, "I dream of a garden, just a small patch of earth, with beans and potatoes, and marigolds. My mother loved marigolds. She spoke of a simple life, a dream so small and ordinary it was heartbreaking in its impossibility. Silas was silent for a long time, his arm tight around her. "I used to dream," he said, his voice rough. After the fire, I stopped, but now," he hesitated. "Now, I see a cabin. Not the old one. A new one. Far from here. With a door that locks." They were whispering dreams they both knew might never come true. Small acts of defiance against the overwhelming despair. In that moment, pressed together against the vast, killing cold. They were no longer a mountain man and a mail-order bride. They were simply a man and a woman, holding on to each other at the end of the world. Clara took a shaky breath. There was one more secret, a truth she had been holding close, a terrifying and beautiful thing. She had suspected for weeks, but the hardship of their flight had made it an undeniable reality. "Silas," she began, her voice trembling. "There is something else. Another reason we must find a safe place." She took his large, calloused hand and pressed it to her flat stomach. "I am with child." The words fell into the silence of the cave, and for a moment, the only sound was the crackle of the fire. She felt him go rigid, his entire body tensing as if he had taken a blow. She saw the twin emotions warring in his eyes, illuminated by the firelight. First came the terror, stark and absolute. He looked at her, then at the unforgiving wilderness around them, and the ghosts of his past rose to haunt him. He had lost one child to this world. The thought of bringing another into such suffering, of failing to protect them, was an agony beyond words. But then, the terror receded, replaced by something else, a profound, aching softness. A child, their child, a seed of life in the midst of death, a reason to fight, a future. His expression softened, the hard lines of his face gentling, and he pulled her closer, his hands spreading protectively over her belly. He bent his head, his forehead resting against hers, a gesture of submission to this awesome, terrifying news. He held her for a long time, and when he finally spoke, his voice was thick with an emotion so deep it was almost a prayer. He tilted her chin up, his eyes locking with hers. "You came here with one shoe," he said softly, his voice a low vow, "and I swore I'd carry you." The old promise, spoken in pity on a snowy night, was now reborn as a sacred oath, sealed by the life of their unborn child. He would not fail. He would carry them both. Their fragile hope was short-lived. A few days later, as they made their way through a narrow, snow-choked canyon, they found their path blocked. 3 men on horseback stood at the far end, their figures dark against the white snow. They were not lawmen. They were hard-faced and carried their rifles with an easy familiarity. Bounty hunters, drawn by the money Creed had offered. There was no escape. The canyon walls were too steep to climb. Silas's eyes darted around, assessing the situation. He pushed Clara behind a cluster of boulders. "Stay here," he commanded, his voice deadly calm. "Do not move, no matter what you hear." He gave her a long, final look, his eyes conveying everything he could not say. Then he turned, his rifle coming up to his shoulder, and stepped into the open. "That is far enough," Silas's voice boomed, echoing off the canyon walls. The lead rider, a man with a thick, greasy beard, laughed. "Nowhere left to run. Ward, the woman makes you slow. Give her up, and we might just bring you in alive." "She is not with me," Silas lied, his voice like ice. "Do not play us for fools," the man sneered, raising his own rifle. "We have been tracking you for a week." The world exploded in a chaos of sound and fury. Silas fired first, his shot ricocheting off the rock near the lead rider's head, sending the horse rearing. The bounty hunters returned fire, the canyon filling with the roar of gunshots and the whine of bullets striking stone. Silas was a ghost, moving from rock to rock, using the terrain he knew so well. He was only one man, but he was a man defending his entire world. Clara watched in terror from behind the rocks. She saw one of the men fall from his horse. She saw Silas take aim, his face a mask of lethal concentration. Then she saw him stumble. A dark stain blossomed on his side, spreading rapidly across the heavy fabric of his coat. He had been hit. He staggered but did not fall. Letting out a roar of pain and rage, he fired again, and a second rider cried out, clutching his arm. The last man, the leader, saw his chance. With Silas wounded, he spurred his horse forward, intending to ride him down. But Silas, in a final, desperate act, dropped his empty rifle and pulled his wood axe from his belt as the horse bore down on him. He lunged forward, not at the man, but at the horse's legs. It was a terrible, brutal act of desperation. The horse screamed and crumpled, throwing its rider into the snow. The man lay stunned for a moment, and that was all the time Silas needed. When it was over, Silas stood alone in the silent canyon, leaning heavily on his axe. One man was dead. The other two had fled, one wounded. But the victory was costly. Silas slumped to his knees, his hand pressed to the bleeding wound in his side. Clara ran to him, her heart in her throat. He was pale, his breathing shallow. "Silas!" she cried, helping him back to the relative cover of the rocks. The bullet had gone clean through, but he was losing a great deal of blood. She knew she had to stop the bleeding. Without hesitation, she ripped a long, clean strip from the bottom of her wool petticoat, the last decent garment she owned. She tore it into bandages, her hands moving with a desperate haste. She packed the wound and bound it tightly, her touch gentle but firm. She was no longer a frightened girl. She was a woman fighting for the life of her man, for the life of her child. They hid in the canyon until nightfall. The cold was their greatest enemy now. Silas's wound brought on a raging fever. He shivered uncontrollably, his teeth chattering. They had no food, no shelter. They managed to build a small fire, but it was not enough to fight off the deep, penetrating cold of the high mountains. They burned the last of their possessions to keep it alive. Silas's leather pack, the spare blanket, even the wooden stock of his empty rifle. Each item fed to the flames was a piece of their hope turning to ash. By the third day, Silas was on the brink of death. He was delirious, his mind lost in a fevered landscape of past and present. In a brief moment of lucidity, his eyes cleared, and he looked at her, his gaze filled with a terrible clarity. "Clara," he rasped, his hand weakly gripping hers. "You have to go. There is a mining settlement. 2 days' walk to the west. You have to save yourself." "The child!" His voice broke. He was trying to fulfill his promise, even if it meant dying alone. He was trying to carry her. One last time. Tears streamed down her face, freezing on her cheeks. She shook her head, her grip on his hand fierce, possessive. "No," she said, her voice raw but unyielding. "I will not leave you. Do you hear me? Silas, I will not leave you." She would not let him go. She would not let the mountains have him. She spent the long, frozen night holding him, pouring her own life force, her own desperate will, into him. She bathed his face with snowmelt, forced trickles of water between his cracked lips. She spoke to him without stopping, her voice a low, steady murmur against the wind. She told him of the garden she would plant, of the son she would bear him, of the life they would build. She wrapped her love around him like a blanket, a fierce, desperate, and sacred thing. Sometime in the deepest, coldest hour before the dawn, his shivering stopped, his breathing, which had been a ragged, shallow gasp, deepened. He opened his eyes, and the delirium was gone. He was weak, exhausted, but he was there. He was back. He looked at her, his wife in all but name, who had refused to let him die. And he knew he had been saved not by medicine or strength, but by a love so ferocious it could stare down death itself. The moment was both a miracle and a tragedy. a sacred vow made on the very precipice of the grave. They were alive, but they were trapped, with nothing left but each other. Spring returned to the mountains not as a gentle guest, but as a conquering army. The thaw was a slow, violent awakening. The deep snows, which had been their prison and their shield, began to weep. The steady drip, drip, drip of melting ice, a constant ticking clock counting down to a new life. The great, silent rivers of ice that choked the canyons groaned, cracked, and finally broke apart with the sound of thunder, unleashing torrents of roaring, churning water that scoured the mountainsides and brought the scent of damp earth and new life to the air. For Silas and Clara, survival was a fragile, moment-to-moment thing. They were ghosts of themselves, gaunt and weak, but they were alive, and as the world around them came back to life, so too did they. They found the first tender shoots of wild onion pushing through the mud, their sharp taste an explosion of flavor after a winter of bland subsistence. Silas, his wounded side still a deep, pulling ache, fashioned a crude fishing weir in the newly raging stream and caught small, silvery trout, their flesh a gift of pure sustenance. Every small victory, every mouthful of food, was a miracle that slowly rebuilt their strength. As soon as he could walk without the world tilting, Silas's gaze turned upward, not in defeat, but in search. He was a man reborn with a singular, ferocious purpose. He had to build a sanctuary, a place so hidden and so safe that the world below could never touch them again. He found it 3 days' journey away, a high mountain meadow nestled in a hidden valley, protected on all sides by sheer granite cliffs. A clear, cold stream ran through it, and the southern exposure promised a long season of sun. It was a pocket of paradise, a secret kept by the mountains. The building of their new home was an act of faith. Silas, though still gaunt, swung his axe with a renewed strength, his lean muscles cording as he felled pine trees. The rhythmic thud of the axe was a sound of creation, not destruction. He was not building a shelter. He was building a future. Clara, her body changing, the gentle swell of her belly a constant, wondrous reminder of the life she carried, worked alongside him. She stripped the bark from the logs with a draw knife, her hands growing calloused and strong. She gathered moss from the forest floor to chink the gaps, her fingers weaving a seal against the wind and the cold. This cabin was different from the last. It was theirs. They planned it together, deciding where the single window would go to catch the most morning light, where to build the hearth that would be the heart of their home. As the walls rose, log by log, Clara felt a sense of belonging so profound it was a physical ache in her chest. She was not a mail-order bride, not a fugitive, not a victim. She was a builder. She was putting down roots in the wild earth. The child grew within her, a silent, powerful presence, a symbol of their impossible renewal. Every kick and flutter was a promise that life, however hard-pressed, would endure. One day in late summer, a visitor appeared. Not a threat, but a ghost from Silas's past. An old, grizzled trapper named Jebediah, a man who had known Silas before the fire, had followed a game trail into their hidden valley. He stood at the edge of the clearing, his eyes wide with disbelief. First at the sight of Silas, whom he had long thought lost to grief, and then at the sight of the pregnant woman who stood beside him. That night, they shared a meal of roasted grouse. Jebediah was a font of news from the world below, the first they had heard in months. He spoke of cattle prices and railroad rumors, and then, his voice dropping, he spoke of Three Forks. "Queerest thing happened to that Amos Creed," he said, poking the fire with a stick. "The man you had the tussle with got himself killed." Clara went utterly still, her hands frozen in her lap. "Was not anything grand," Jebediah continued, oblivious to the storm his words had caused. "No gunfight or anything. He was in the saloon, drunk as usual, accusing a card sharp of cheating. Words were passed, fists were thrown. Creed fell back, hit his head on the corner of the bar, stone dead before he hit the floor. The marshal called it an accident. Nobody shed a tear. The news settled over Clara not with a feeling of victory or vengeance, but with a profound, soul-deep quiet. The final thread that bound her to a life of fear had been cut. Amos Creed had not been vanquished by a hero. He had been consumed by the ugliness of his own life. She was free. She looked over at Silas, and he reached across the small space between them, his hand covering hers. A silent acknowledgement. A chapter was closed. Autumn painted the mountains in hues of gold and amber. The nights grew crisp. And then, one evening, the sky turned a bruised, angry purple. A thunderstorm. The last of the season rolled in, the air thick with electricity. As the first clap of thunder rattled the window of their new cabin, a sharp, clenching pain seized Clara, taking her breath away. The baby was coming. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through the peace Silas had so carefully built. He was a man who could face down bounty hunters and blizzards. But this was a different kind of wilderness. The memory of the family he had lost, the smell of smoke, the terrible finality of it all, rose like a specter. He was terrified that the mountain, having given him this second chance, would snatch it away in a final, cruel act. But Clara's strength was his anchor. Her face was pale with pain, but her eyes were clear and determined. There was no doctor, no midwife, only the two of them and the storm raging outside. He boiled water, his hands trembling. He tore clean linen into strips. He held her hand, his big, rough fingers wrapped around hers, whispering encouragement, his voice a low, steady rumble against the crashing thunder. He was a man who knew how to bring a newborn calf into the world, but this was different. This was a miracle, and he was a terrified, unworthy witness. The labor was long and hard, a battle fought by the light of a single lantern while the storm lashed their small cabin. And then, in a moment when the world seemed to hold its breath between a flash of lightning and a roll of thunder, the baby came, a wave of slick, warm life into his trembling hands. For a terrifying second, there was silence, and then a cry, a strong, lusty, furious wail that cut through the noise of the storm and filled the small cabin with the undeniable, triumphant sound of life. It was the sound that broke him. The grief he had held inside for 10 long years, the guilt, the loneliness, the despair, it all came undone. He looked from the tiny, perfect child, a son, to Clara, who lay exhausted but radiant on their bed. Tears streamed down Silas's face, carving clean paths through the grime and sweat. He gently placed the swaddled baby in the crook of her arm and sank to his knees beside the bed, his broad shoulders shaking. He buried his face in the blankets, his voice a choked, broken whisper. "You brought life back," he wept. "You brought life back to this cursed mountain." He was not just speaking of the child. He was speaking of himself. She had found him in his tomb of grief and had led him back into the sun. Time passed. The seasons turned. The legend of the mountain man who had stolen a bride faded into the murky realm of saloon gossip and tall tales. But a new story began to be told, a quieter, more wondrous one. A surveyor, charting new territory for the railroad, got lost in the high country. He followed a stream, hoping it would lead him back to the valley, and stumbled upon a place that did not exist on any map. He wrote about it later in a letter to his brother. "I found a valley," he wrote, "a place of impossible peace. There was a small, sturdy cabin, smoke curling from its chimney, and a garden that would be the envy of any farmer's wife, teeming with vegetables and wildflowers, buzzing with bees. I did not approach, for it felt like trespassing on holy ground. But I watched for a time. I saw a woman, her hair the color of corn silk, walking barefoot through the tall green grass. She moved as if she were a part of the place, as if she had grown there herself. She stumbled on a loose stone, and before she could fall, a tall man, a giant of a man with a wild beard, emerged from the cabin. He did not help her to her feet. He simply lifted her into his arms and carried her gently back to the house, as if she were the most precious thing in the world. Their story, born in the crucible of tragedy and violence, had been transformed. It became a legend whispered around campfires, a tale of two lost souls who had found not just survival, but a state of grace in the heart of the unforgiving wilderness. The sun was setting, painting the high peaks of their valley in shades of rose and gold. Silas sat on the porch step of the cabin he had built, a solid, peaceful man. The lines of grief that had once seemed permanently etched on his face had softened. Beside him sat Clara, her head resting on his shoulder. In her arms, their son, Daniel, slept, his small face serene in the fading light. Silas looked at the woman who had brought life back to his world, and at the child who was its proof. His heart was full. He was no longer the hermit, the ghost of the mountain. He was a husband and a father. The past was not gone, but its wounds had become scars, and its ghosts had finally found their peace. He leaned down and pressed a kiss to her hair, his voice a quiet murmur against the vast, beautiful silence of their home. The words were the same ones he had spoken to a broken, sleeping girl in a snowstorm long ago. But now, they were not a promise of rescue. They were a statement of fact, a vow for all the days to come. I'll carry you the rest of the way. Thank you for joining us on this journey. Please let us know where you are listening from in the comments to connect with fellow travelers. Subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts in English.